Anime and manga were not seen as they are today. They were actually seen as a kind of trash culture, and I was told don't talk about them that much. And so I came up with this phrase to describe the types of products I think that Japan is uniquely adept at making. I call them fantasy delivery devices. You know, we met Yuji Horii, who was the director of the Dragon Quest series.
Hey there, and thank you for tuning in. We're excited to bring you another great conversation today. If you like the show and want to support us, please hit the subscribe button so we can keep bringing you great content week after week. And if you're feeling extra generous, give this video a like and share your thoughts and comments down below. Thank you so much. And now, let's get into it. Welcome to Unpacking Japan. I'm Toby, and today we welcome Matt Alt in the studio. Thank you so much for coming.
Well, thanks for having me.
You're the author of Pure Invention, How Japan Made the Modern World.
That's true.
And many more very interesting essays that have been published in places like the New York Times, the New Yorker, and more. You've worked in Japan for quite a while, have many stories to share, and you are really into pop culture.
Yes, this is all right. This is true.
So thank you for coming, for making time to join us here in Osaka. And we're going to dive into your journey to Japan and maybe start at the very beginning a little bit with what brought you here in the first place.
Wow, what brought me here in the first place is toys. Toys. I was obsessed with Japanese toys as a kid, and let's be honest, as an adult, continuing today. But I received a robot toy from my grandmother when I was 5 years old, and this was in maybe 1978. And it was a Japanese robot toy. It actually had Japanese written on a sticker on the stomach.
Okay.
And I really loved the toy itself, but that sticker with the Japanese language on it really just triggered something in me. And I remember I couldn't read it. I learned to read at a pretty young age and very much enjoyed reading, but I couldn't read these letters. They were in katakana. And I remember asking my mother at the time, what is this? What's it say? And she said, I don't know. It's Japanese. And so somehow I got this idea in my head that far, far away was this land of people who loved robots just as much as I did. And I was like, I got to go there, even at this young age. And that's sort of, it all started from there. And I was just obsessed with Japanese toys. That led into things like anime, that led into things like manga, that led into things like video games. And it sort of built this image in my head of a sort of fantasy land that existed outside of what was then the dominant pop culture in the world, America.
You kind of started developing this image of Japan from a very young age, and I imagine it grew through your years, through the different hobbies that were added. When was a time in your life when you kind of really more seriously considered like making plans to move to Japan?
I was very fortunate in that my high school, which was a public high school in Maryland, the suburbs of Washington, D.C., just happened to be one of the first public schools in all of America that had a Japanese language program. And
Wow.
so, yeah, I was able to start studying Japanese as a freshman in high school, which was very unusual in America of the 1980s. To set the stage here, America viewed Japan as a rival bordering on enemy at the time. This was an era known as Japan bashing. American politicians would destroy Japanese products like, hammering radios or smashing cars in all sorts of stunts to drum up publicity about how Japanese were taking jobs from Americans and things like that. Literally, you turn on the news, you would go to the movies, and this sort of thing was happening. You would see all sorts of Japanese characters turning up as antagonists. Famously in Back to the Future 2, Mr. Fujitsu, a Japanese guy, fires the middle-aged Marty McFly. Or there were movies like A Rising Sun, where Sean Connery is speaking Japanese. I'm the Shampai. He has this great accent with his speaking Japanese. And he is battling these kind of venal Japanese salarymen who are trying to take over the world. But for us kids, we saw Japan in a very different way because we were interacting with Japan through its fantasies, through things like the Nintendo Entertainment System or the Transformers or comic books or cartoons or things like that. So for me, Japan was never this kind of rival. It was always a sort of source of fascination. And it was in high school, in this very roundabout way to answer your question, that I started to very seriously think about getting over to Japan. And I could because they actually offered homestays during our spring breaks and things like
That's
that.
such a unique opportunity as a high school kid to get to do a homestay in an overseas like school exchange in high school.
Yes. And back then, very few foreigners visited Japan. We're talking 1988, 89, 90, this sort of time frame. And it was very unusual for American kids to be studying Japanese. We were widely profiled in the mass media of the time. The Washington Post did a big article on our class. The Crown Prince of Japan visited our class. I mean, it was who later became the emperor. We were constantly having guests like big journalists. James Fallows came and talked to our class. He became the editor of The Atlantic.
Wow.
So, we were very much this source of fascination to a lot of Americans as well, that Japan might not be simply this economic rival. It might be something more.
When you built up this image of this country for so long, what was it like when you actually first arrived here?
So it was funny. I was the kind of kid who would cry at like going to sleepaway camp. I was very much somebody who liked to stay at home and sleep in my own bed. So I was a little nervous when I first went over to Japan. It must have been the age of like 14 or 15. And it was a very stimulating, unique sort of experience. I mean, I barely spoke Japanese back then. I just started learning it. And it was really interesting to me. The biggest thing that shocked me was that, anime and manga were not seen as they are today, which is to say this sort of engine for driving the Japanese economy, this source of pride, cool Japan, as it's known. They were actually seen as a kind of trash culture. And I was told, don't talk about them that much. Don't bring them up. Of course, other kids read manga, but they didn't want me talking about this sort of interest in front of other adults. So that was a big shocker to me, that parents discouraged their kids from reading comic books, discouraged them from playing video games, discouraged them from watching anime. And that was kind of a shock.
Especially now, if you consider like today, it's like such a big part of society at all ages. Right?
Absolutely. Even I couldn't have imagined how big Japanese pop culture would get. I was very much an outlier at the time. All of the other, or I should say most of the other students in the class were studying because they wanted to go into business. Or they wanted to incorporate Japanese into their careers. I and several of my close friends were mainly only interested in deciphering manga and anime and things like that, because very little of it was available in English at the time.
Where did you go for your homestay?
So the school that I was going to, Walt Whitman High School in Bethesda, Maryland, had a kind of sister relationship with this school called Odawara High School, Odawara in Kanagawa. And so my first experiences in Japan weren't really in the big city. They were in, Odawara is not a small town.
It's near Hakone, right?
Yes,
the
exactly.
beginning of the Hakone Valley.
Yeah. And I remember first morning, staying with my homestay, having a Japanese sort of breakfast, and on the train platform, you could see Mount Fuji. And I was like, wow. To quote an American movie, we aren't in Kansas anymore. And it was really an amazing experience. And sitting in on Japanese, like a high school class, getting to study with them, even if just for a week, was a really eye-opening experience.
Was there anything in particular that for you really resonated? You said you shouldn't talk about manga and anime, for example, but were you able to exchange with the local kids?
Oh, absolutely. After school. After school let out, all bets were off. We headed to the arcade. We went and saw anime movies. We bought manga. They were really fascinated by the fact that an American would be interested in this stuff, because at the time, I think a lot of the kids were shocked that things they liked were popular with somebody who was American. At the time, they weren't exported abroad. And so it was very surprising to them that I would know something like Space Cruiser Yamato, which was a really popular science fiction series, or Macross.
Is that the one that is inspired by this one Navy ship from Japan that kind of made it through the World War, and now it's been kind of idealized? And there's
absolutely
okay.
And I remember very clearly walking down the hallway and hearing one of the kids in music class practicing the theme on his trumpet. and going in and talking to him. And that started this whole conversation. So it was interesting. The adults were kind of discouraging it. But for people of my generation, which is to say teenagers back then, it was very much a kind of a can opener. It would open all sorts of situations for me with other kids. It definitely allowed me to talk to them about it. Was a shared interest that they weren't expecting to have. And most of them were interested in talking about Hollywood movies and things like that. And I was happy to do that as well. But the fact we could do both, it was an interesting kind of cross-cultural moment.
Was there like a language barrier, or was your Japanese good enough that you could exchange?
There was absolutely a language barrier. I had really only been studying for a year and a half to 2 years at that point, and at the high school level. So it wasn't as intensive as a college course. Our teacher was amazing. Her name was Jean Morden, and I actually dedicated Pure Invention to her because she was the one who sort of opened Japan to me in many ways. But she was an military. She had served in the American Navy during World War II and had taken a crash course to learn Japanese very quickly, and spent the war interpreting like the letters that they found from pilots they would find, or if they captured a soldier and he had documents on them, they would send it back to America to be deciphered. No Google Translate back then or anything.
Wow.
And so she had a very different view of Japan than I did. When she first arrived in Japan in 1945, it was flat. It had been flattened by American bombings. She had fought Japan during the war, and although she loved Japan and was very much a part of helping it rebuild, to her, the idea that one would be interested in Japan because of its pop culture was sort of alien to her. But she was a great teacher, so she supported anything that stimulated her students to want to learn, that engaged them. But we had very different views of Japan.
You were 14, 15 at the time. You go there for a summer homestay and exchange. So comes the time you fly back. You go back to Maryland, Bethesda,
Yes.
and you have this head full of impressions. Do you decide already then, like, no, I'm going back to Japan?
Oh, I every single time when I never felt homesick in Japan. I sometimes felt dislocated culturally. My Japanese wasn't so great yet. And there are so many little aspects of Japanese culture that you need to just experience before you can absorb them into yourself. Simple things like taking off your shoes, but many other things too, in the ways that you interact with people. The forms of humor that were popular among teenagers in America didn't necessarily convey in Japan, things like that. But it was always, and sometimes there was friction, sometimes there were issues, but overall it was a great experience. And so I resolved that I would study Japanese more seriously in college. And my college, University of Wisconsin, had a sister relationship with Keio University in Tokyo. So for my junior year in college, I was able to study abroad in Tokyo for a year. And that was the real eye-opening experience. That was when I was living in the heart of Tokyo. I was studying in the heart of Tokyo. And, I was able to spend my free time exploring Tokyo. And that's when I knew that I would probably end up living here.
You do 1 year at Keio University. You finish your degree. And then you need a plan. Come back here, right? You need to find, dreaming is great, but if you want to put it into action, you need to find a way to come back. So work, more studies.
Yes.
How did you decide or make the move to come here for good?
What I did was become a translator. I'd always enjoyed writing. I briefly, considered majoring in English in college. I always, did well in creative writing courses and things like that. Journalism. I also briefly flirted with majoring in journalism. I eventually ended up majoring in Japanese and international relations. But I used my language skills to get me into places that probably wouldn't have given me the time of day otherwise. When you speak another language and you can translate it well, it opens all sorts of opportunities. And one of the first that I had was working for the U.S. government at the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. So I spent 5 years as a government employee and translating all sorts of these technical documents and things like that, and sort of biding my time trying to figure out how I might get back to Japan. And I dreamed of working at some kind of big pop cultural company, an anime studio, a video game company. I didn't care what. But it was really tough to get those kinds of jobs from the United States then and now. But what happened was, just sort of out of the blue, an old friend of mine contacted me and said, a company came to me and wants me to translate this video game. I'm too busy. Do you want to handle it? And I said, sure, as a freelance thing. And when I looked at it, I was like, wow, this is some serious. And when we're talking in the late 90s, back then, you didn't have any of the tools that you have now. You didn't even have things like Microsoft Word or Excel. Mm-hmm. You're just looking at text documents with no context at all whatsoever. And so I asked my then girlfriend at the time, who has since become my wife, Hiroko, will you work on this with me? And she said yes, and we did it. We translated this video game together, and it turned out to be quite a decent amount of money. The company said, do you want to do another? Sure. That led to another and another. And we realized that we might be able to make a business out of this, working together. A Japanese woman, native speaker, and an American man, native speaker of English, combining our forces together to translate pop cultural sorts of things. And at the time in the late 90s, this was a very unique sort of job. There weren't a lot of people doing it. So we were able to build up a client base and make a go at it.
I briefly worked here in Japan at a game localization company.
Oh, did you?
The way things were done is, you have to play through the game, you have to check the text in the version and correct the mistakes in the various languages, check for bugs and whatnot.
Yes.
And this is all now done with computers, software, and Google Sheets and whatnot. You said there's no Excel, there's no Word back then. You get the game in what form? How did you even translate this game? And can you even tell which game? What game was it back then?
Yeah, no. It was the very first game we translated was called Silhouette Mirage. It was a platformer. I think it was originally developed by a company called Treasure in Japan, but in America, it was a company called Working Designs that was publishing it. Mm-hmm. And Working Designs was pretty famous for localizing its role-playing games, Japanese role-playing games. After Silhouette Mirage went well, we worked on a game called Lunar, Silver Star Story, a big role-playing game, and one that I had played as a kid, an earlier version. So it was really exciting to me to get to work on this version. But yeah, we didn't have Word, we didn't have Excel, we didn't even have the word localization. The word localization did not really exist back then. It was just translation. And it was often an uphill battle to even convince Japanese clients that having native speakers work on these products was an advantage. For a very long time, in the NES era, the Sega era, most games were translated by non-native speakers. This is where you get all sorts of wacky English phrases like a winner is you in NES Pro Wrestling, or the very, very famous all your base or belong to us in the Sega Mega Drive Zero Wing game. So the idea that people would be seriously translating text grammatically, idiomatically, was a sort of unique idea at the time. And we actually had to sell that to many of the companies we talked to. You need to do this. You should do this.
Because they were only focused on the Japanese market and not necessarily thinking about the potential of those games, of the interest in those games in a market like the US market or European market.
One of the great advantages and disadvantages of Japanese creatives is that they pretty much only tend to think of the audience in front of them. Most of the products that have become global hits abroad, almost all of them, pop cultural products at any rate, were made by Japanese for Japanese audiences. And the foreign audience was absolutely a secondary concern, if even that, to the people who made it. So the translation of games for a long time was seen as a sort of secretarial, after the fact, whatever, was sort of the attitude that many companies had toward it. That's obviously changed now. But at the time in the late 90s, the idea that native speakers would take over the translation of video games was still very new. But it was great because Hiroko and I could get in on the ground floor. And that's when we launched Alt Japan. That's the name of our localization company. We started it as Alt Japan Inc. in America in 1999. And then when we moved to Japan in 2003, it became a Japanese company. And we still run it today, although we've shifted from localization into different sorts of things, content creation, writing the books, consulting. We consult with many different kinds of companies. But we started as a localization firm, and localization is very near and dear to my heart.
You said the company was originally set up in the United States, and then you moved it to Japan in 2003.
Yes.
How did you transfer? Did you close it down, open a new one? How did you kind of make that move?
Yeah, there's all sorts of sort of business things. The American Inc. was shut down, and we had to found a what's known as a kabushiki gaisha, a Japanese entity here in Japan. But the reason that we launched the company in the first place was I had been moonlighting doing this work at nights and on weekends from the Patent and Trademark Office. And after a few years of this, and Hiroko and I realized that we would be losing money to say no to jobs that we couldn't do because I had my full-time job at the government. And we realized at that point it was time to quit the government and pivot into doing localization full-time. Once we did that around 1999, 2000, and I did actually keep my job for a little bit longer after that, it was only a matter of time before we relocated from Maryland to Japan, because that's where all of our clients were. And my wife, Hiroko, is Japanese. And so she, of course, had no problem with going back and living in Japan. And I wanted to live in Japan. So it was a no-brainer.
Localizing or translating patents is one thing. Localizing video games is a completely different kind of work, both with their own challenges. What were some of these early days translation challenges that you were facing and that you had to kind of deal with?
Well, I wouldn't call what we did at the Patent and Trademark Office localization. That's translation. It's you need to be as close word to what the original patent spec, the document is, so that the patent examiners can understand exactly what was in the original document. What we were doing is called translating prior art. Prior art, it means that when somebody comes into the Patent and Trademark Office with a new invention or an application for a patent on a new invention, it's the patent examiner's job to explore patents all over the world and see if somebody invented this or something similar to it elsewhere. If they, in their keyword searches or whatever, found a patent in Japan that looked similar, they would then bring it down and ask us to translate it, either verbally look at it and say, what does this say, or translate it into text so that they could use it in their proceedings to determine whether the new application coming in would be approved or not. So that was very much a literal translation of what's in the document. There's no style except for patent style. And you wanted to be as close to what is on the page as humanly possible. Localization is translation plus any changes that need to be made to the text to appeal to who is consuming it, with the ideal being that the person consuming the content feels almost as if it was written for them in their native language. That's the ideal of localization. And or it was at any rate. And so they're very different sorts of work with very different sorts of challenges. Patents have a lot of technical terms in them. Video games and comic books do too, but those technical terms tend to be things like idioms.
Yeah, I see.
Or in-world, in-game sort of terminology, that sort of thing.
That you sometimes have to kind of invent new words for.
Yes, absolutely.
Do you then trademark those words?
No, trademarks, yes. You could copyright those, I suppose. And it depends. Are they part of a system? There's all sorts of rules about what can be patented, what can be trademarked, what can be copyrighted. Copyright is for concepts. It's for texts and things like that. Trademarks are for brand names.
Oh, I see.
Patents are for systems, kind of design, inventions.
Okay.
Physical inventions. Although you can get them on things beyond that now.
So when you came, you basically established your company right away, and you suddenly went from doing this on the side and earning a nice additional income for your family to now this is our main source of business. We need to make it work, and we're here in Japan. We need to convince the clients. How was it? How was that experience for you to have the business here now, really needing to establish it to the point that okay, well, you need a constant inflow of a pop culture company to hire you.
Biz dev, that's what you call it. Business development, right? And when you run a small company, that becomes your full-time job developing new clients. And so, but in a certain sense, it got easier when we came to Japan. We could network. We could meet other people in the localization industry. We could meet with companies. I had friends working at big game companies. A really good friend of mine who I had met at KO, Alex Smith, was working for Square at the time. Now Square Enix, but then just Square. And so he introduced us to their localization team. And so we were able to start talking to them, and that led to work coming from them. And it was a small industry, word got around. And a lot of times either freelancers or small companies had too much on their hands. Hey, can you do this? Do you want to do this? So it was very stressful, and we didn't have a lot of safety net. But on the other hand, it was a pretty tight-knit community. And, we didn't really have that much of a problem finding work, especially at first. There were definitely dark periods there. The Lehman shock, the global, financial crisis of 2008, that really put a damper on things. But, we never really ran out of there was a huge need for this. And there were very few at the time people and companies who could do this. That's changed.
Yeah, now it's a very competitive field.
Hugely competitive. It's become a commodity sort of field. Back in time, it was very bespoke. It was very, you would get on a wavelength with a director or producer. You're the one for the job. And every project was kind of spec'd out very uniquely. Now it's become very much a commodity, and it's a battle over who can deliver the most at the lowest price.
Yeah.
And also localization itself has become kind of a lightning rod, especially among certain fans who believe, I think mistakenly, but not always, that certain types of political thinking are being injected into the translations of the games. So I never expected localization to become controversial in that way, but it has. In certain parts of the internet, saying you're a localizer is going to attract a lot of criticism, and that is a big change from when we got started back in the 1990s. Again, no Word, no Excel. Hiroko and I were literally translating off of printed reams of paper. We would print out code because the text was all embedded in the code. And then we would have to look for the lines of dialogue. We didn't see the game. We couldn't see the game back then.
Did that ever create problems such as you translate the text, but then the text you suggest doesn't actually fit in whatever text box was designed in the game?
Well, what would happen back then is that the localization director would set word limits or character limits. And often they would have to set them across the game just to whatever the minimum amount of text that would fit into something was, or whatever the maximum that would fit in would become the maximum for everything, even if you had more lines or something like that. So it was and then they would go in and adjust it by hand. It was a very by hand thing. You didn't have any translation memories. You didn't have any tools like we do now. Certainly no large language models or predictive text or translation or anything. Hiroko, when we translated Silhouette Mirage in 98, I believe it was, we literally, like I said, printed things out on paper, that sprocket printer paper, with the little holes in the sides. And we would translate, we'd sit down at a restaurant somewhere, like a pizza place, and talk and eat and translate. And then I would go back and enter it into the code, and we would send these files back to the company that requested it. So, and that continued for quite some time. I think finally, I can't remember what game we were on where Excel finally came into the mix. Maybe it was the Dragon Quest, then known as Dragon Warrior 7. And that made things a lot easier. You could do search and replace and stuff.
You were dreaming of working with anything pop culture related, and suddenly you have your own company, you're localizing games. And it gives you this huge kind of look at the behind the scenes of all these things that you were interacting with when you were a kid growing up. And it made you think about Japanese pop culture, how it's evolving, how it's changing, and came a point where you decided to start writing about it.
Yeah, I didn't think too much about it at the time because I was too busy. But after a while, I think probably after a good 10, maybe even 15 years of this, I started to realize what a privileged position we were in. Being localizers gave us a seat at the table with some of Japan's top creators, top producers, these big companies. In a very real way, we were looking into the beating heart of the Japanese, pop cultural machine.
Who are some of these kind of heroes or big producers that you had the opportunity to kind of work with?
Well, we got to interact with a lot. We met, Yuji Horii, who was the director of the Dragon Quest series. We only got to speak to him a little bit. We didn't really work that closely with him, but that was when we worked on Dragon Quest 8. We did get to sit down and have a conference room and meet him. That was a big moment. He was a really transformative. His way of making video games transformed the Japanese console gaming industry. We met people like Mr. Itagaki, who is the director of the Ninja Gaiden series. That was a really big one. So many others. I mean, in the toy world, I got to meet the people who had made the die-cast robot toys that I had grown up on when I was a kid, the transforming toys. I got to meet the creator of Voltron.
Did you ever figure out what was written on that toy?
I did. Well, actually, after I learned Japanese, my first in class, in my Japanese class, I remember the first time the teacher gave us the katakana tables to memorize. I took them home and started to decipher what was written on my Gundam plastic model boxes, or the stomach of that giant robot. And it was really interesting to finally meet the people who had made these toys. And to tell them, I wouldn't have been here without the things you had made.
They probably never realized the impact they would have by making those.
Yeah, well, I think they knew by the point that I had come over here that Japanese pop culture was getting bigger, but that's one thing. And then actually meeting somebody, for instance, I met Yoshiyuki Tomino, the creator of Gundam.
Oh, wow.
And I remember saying to him, it was at a press conference, and afterwards I was given a few minutes to talk to him, and I'm like, literally, without Gundam and without Gundam model kits, I wouldn't be in Japan. And he's this notoriously cantankerous, grumpy guy. And he just kind of melted. And it was a really nice, he's like, wow, that's amazing that you said that. And then making that kind of connection, it felt like, this is what I learned Japanese for. Not to make money or not to make a company, but to kind of meet these architects of me. And working in the game industry was another way of doing that. Every time you translate a game, of course, you're doing a job, but it's also, you're learning about the system and how things are made, and by extension, learning about yourself. And that's what gave me the idea to start writing about this. I had experienced this in a way that most people never get to, even Japanese people. Most Japanese people don't get to go inside of a Japanese video game company or an anime studio. They don't get to meet the director of Gundam, or hang out with the people who, design transforming toys or Godzilla. So I was like, wow, I really want to talk more about this. How did Japan become this target of admiration, this fantasy land for people all over the world? My grandfather fought the Japanese in World War II. That's a big shift in image, from enemy to rival to more than friend. It's like a place of dreams now for many people.
So you start digging into this and kind of trying to analyze, look back at your 10, 15 years of experience, think back about all the encounters you had. Where was your starting point there? You need to start writing somewhere. Right. You need to start, from which angle do I start trying to analyze or make sense of this all? Well,
we all knew Japan was cool, but how do you quantify that? And I spent a lot of time thinking about this before I even started writing. And I'd have conversations with a lot of friends. And a lot of my friends are writers and fellow kind of explorers of Japanese pop culture. I'm neighbors with W. David Marks, who is a writer. He wrote a great book called Ame Tora, which is about how Japan saved American style. It's about how...
you're neighbors with him?
Yes. And David and I talked a lot about this. I remember us taking walks in the local park, and that gave me some kind of ideas. And finally, I hit on, the best way to do this is to explore chronologically the big hit products that came out of Japan and try to find through lines through them. And so I came up with these lists of products, big hits, and I would start to try to find where can I tell a story from this, or what are the most key, the most important ones. And finally, I isolated a group of them, like the first toys that Japan made after World War II, the first karaoke machine, the Walkman, the Famicom, which is the Nintendo Entertainment System, Hello Kitty. These are iconic. How did they get made? Why did they get made? And how did they reach people abroad? And I knew I would have to tell that story before I started to get into the things that personally moved me, robot toys or anime or manga or what have you. And in researching those and finding the key people who were involved in meeting them, the story kind of unfolded almost a little bit magically. It was interesting to see the connections between these seemingly unconnected sorts of things.
If you had to kind of summarize that connection, what was the key element that made them what they became?
Well, as I wrote this book and I started to focus on these inventions, these key innovations, I realized they were more than just products. They were kind of packaged dreams in a lot of ways. And so I came up with this phrase to describe the types of products I think that Japan is uniquely adept at making. I call them fantasy delivery devices, because they're more than just hit products. They transform us as we consume them. There's no kid who played the Nintendo Entertainment System and didn't come out changed from that experience. The Nintendo Entertainment System is so interesting to me because it was the first product that compelled us to consume literal Japanese fantasies. All of the software on there at first was made in Japan. So it was designed by Japanese people for Japanese people. It had new ways of looking at the world. You had heroes that were a little squashed and cute, like Mario, or you had adventures that played out in different ways than they might in Western storytelling. If you're talking about things like Dragon Warrior or Final Fantasy or things like that. And as we consumed these products, we became a little more Japanese ourselves. Mm-hmm. And the same thing was true with me of toys as a kid. And I played video games as well. Anime, manga. These are fantasy delivery devices. They are designed to convey dreams to the people who consume them, first in Japan and then all over the world.
Some of these physical devices have evolved, become obsolete, been replaced by new ones, have become popular again. But all the characters, especially, a lot of them kind of made it through time. You just gave the example of Mario as a small, squashed, pixelated item. Now he's got theme parks with him riding around. The new Mario Kart game, I think, just came out.
Right.
And that franchise has been going on forever.
Absolutely.
You gave the example of Hello Kitty. Mm-hmm. If I'm not mistaken, it's either Hello Kitty or Pokemon that is the most valuable franchise.
Well, some say, there's a lot of, this is actually, it's interesting you bring that up. There's a lot of information online where people are trying to, project what the biggest one of these characters is. But you've got to remember, a lot of these companies are privately held. They don't actually release sales statistics. Sanrio has never, ever released statistics of how much Hello Kitty alone has sold. They release their kind of revenues and things like that in their corporate statements. They have never said how much Hello Kitty makes. That is actually all being projected. It's being guesstimated by people online. So you have to be really careful when you look at these. But there's no question Hello Kitty is a big franchise. There's no question that Mario, Nintendo, Pokemon, these are big, big franchises. How big? And relatively, we don't know the answers to those. And I learned that when I was researching this book because I was I wanted to be very meticulous and concise about how I wanted to base this in reality, not just on vibes. And so it's tough. There's actually there's a surprisingly little amount of information about the size of the markets for many of these characters.
You call them fantasy delivery devices. Fantasies you grew up with, and then you end up studying, researching, analyzing, breaking down into their essence. How did that affect your relationship with those fantasies that you had growing up, and kind of suddenly dismantling them and kind of looking at what was happening behind the scenes and kind of maybe in some case breaking the magic of?
There's a great story that I learned when I was writing the book that Steve Jobs of Apple, he was really good friends with Akio Morita, who was the chairman of Sony. And every time Jobs came to Japan, he would meet with Morita, sometimes for business, sometimes for pleasure. But at some point, Morita gave him a Walkman, one of the early Walkman. I don't think it was a prototype, probably one of the early production models. And Steve Jobs famously loved music, but he never listened to the Walkman. He took it home and dismantled it. He took it apart piece by piece to figure out how this Japanese company had somehow transformed technology into a form of fashion. And he dreamed that someday he'd be able to make something like that himself.
And then came the iPod.
And he did. But I kind of think of myself a little bit like Jobs in that story. I'm no founder of a giant computer empire, but I'm kind of taking apart these fantasies that Japan has given me and seeing how they work. And just like Jobs, he wasn't disenchanted by what he saw. He was energized by it to create something new. I have never, ever been bored or disappointed in what I learned. Sometimes I've been surprised. Many times I've been surprised.
What were some of these surprising things?
Well, I think the biggest surprise from writing Pure Invention was that when it came to every single one of these inventions, the karaoke machine, Hello Kitty, the family computer, the Walkman, none of the people who made these devices believed that they were creating a revolution. They weren't creating them for anybody really except for themselves. The man Mr. Negishi, who made the first karaoke machine, he just wanted to be able to sing and hear his voice come through speakers. The Mr. Osone, who created the Walkman, the engineer who built the first Walkman, he just wanted to walk around and listen to music on the go. None of these people were trying to create a revolution. They were just focused on making something that would please them first. And it turned out that their dream matched all of ours. And that was really interesting. It showed me how difficult it is to create a fad, how difficult it is to create a hit. There's a little magic there, and that magic is fueled by someone's personal passion. It's not something that you can pay for. It's not something that marketing can come up with. And it's not something that you can use focus groups to find out. Sony famously almost never used focus groups. And I bet in 1978, if you had asked people, do you need a portable, tape deck that you can listen to music on? Half the people would have said no. But when they saw this thing and used it for the first time, it changed them. And that, to me, trying to see that moment when someone's creative vision sparks to life, that was what I really wanted to investigate when I was writing the book. Just as when I first held that Japanese robot toy in my hand at age 5 and it awakened something in me. Why is that? How does that happen? It's a very interesting and almost intimate kind of thing.
A lot of the items, the characters that you brought up as examples came from the 80s, the 90s, the early 2000s. Mm-hmm. What are some of these inventions, creations that are coming out of Japan that are making this kind of impact in today's times?
Well, I think one of the most interesting developments is the idea of Japan as a sort of guide to the rest of the world. Like, we're not just consuming stuff from Japan. We're looking at Japan for answers. And we can see this most clearly in the boom for Marie Kondo's cleaning magic. When you think about it, it's kind of wild. Why are Americans and Europeans turning to a Japanese woman for help organizing their sock drawer? Can't we organize our sock drawers by ourselves? But yet they see something in Marie Kondo that goes beyond simply cleaning up. She brings this Japanese sensibility, even philosophy to it. And truly, when you read her books, you can see they're about more than just organizing your sock drawer. They're really about kind of reconnecting with you. And that sort of, the idea that Japan has answers that maybe the West doesn't, I think is the biggest sort of change and fad that we're seeing right now.
This is, I think, particularly interesting because there are also a lot of misconceptions. And you just brought up the example of Marie Kondo and kind of tidying up and cleaning up your room, which you discussed a lot in this essay, where you also kind of compare with this photographer, Suzuki, who had this photography book called Tokyo Style, I believe, where he went to people's houses and just photographed the mess. The clutter, how people actually live. And this kind of idea, okay, well, minimalism, Japan, yes, but in specific contexts, and there are more reasons than just wanting it to be clean behind it. So there's this idea in the West, perhaps in this specific example of, oh, Japan, everything is minimalistic, everything is tidy, everything is, yes, but not always.
It's funny because in America in particular, I think there's this idea of Zen, which is in the West has become a sort of shorthand for minimalist design. It was popularized, I think, a lot by Steve Jobs, whose Apple products feature a kind of simplified aesthetic. And he was famously an adherent of Zen Buddhism as well. But Zen is not used in that way at all in Japanese, as you probably know. If you picked up a iPhone and said to a Japanese person, "This is so Zen," they'd look at you like, "What do you mean?" Because to them, Zen is Zen Buddhism. It's about sitting meditation and being whacked by a by a priest who is telling you to stay focused. It's not about design. It's not about commercialization or anything like that. But I do like Japanese minimalist spaces. I love the temples and rock gardens and things like that. But the spaces that I find myself most attracted to or drawn to in Japan are often the most cluttered. But they're not cluttered. They're cluttered in a very specific way. I call it curated clutter. They tend to be cluttered because they're reflections of the owner's personality. They're filled with objects that are important to that person. So this takes them away from like what we think of as hoarding, and they're not dirty, but they are very packed with stuff. And I realized, when Marie Kondo took off and when I noticed in the West that people were talking so much about minimalism, I was like, well, there's sort of a Japanese maximalism too, isn't there? I mean, you must have noticed these spaces as well.
Yeah, they're usually full, especially if you live, for example, in a danchi, kind of residential area with a lot of elderly people, and you walk past the apartments. If the door is open, you'll see there are usually things everywhere.
Well, you have to ask yourself, if Japan really was this paragon of cleanliness, why would it have needed to invent Marie Kondo? I mean, she exists because there's a need for this kind of cleaning magic in Japan as well. Kyoichi Suzuki, who wrote that book you mentioned, Tokyo Style, which focuses on the authentically cluttered living spaces of average Japanese people, frames this in terms of basically social class. The more wealthy you are, the easier it is to attain a minimalist lifestyle. You're able to have a larger home. You're able to have bigger closets. You can hide this stuff away. You can hire people to clean for you. If you don't have that money, you probably don't have a big house. You don't have storage. You have to hang your clothes on the walls. Your books are just going to be sitting in piles on the floor. So it's when we talk about minimalism versus maximalism, we're also often talking about things like upper crust, upper class versus, middle class, lower class in terms of societally speaking. And indeed, Zen Buddhism was practiced by elites in Japan. This wasn't a kind of populist religious movement. It was very much for the elites, the aristocrats, the aristocracy. So, there's that also interesting way of looking at this. One of the reasons I like cluttered places is because they feel very homey. They feel very, there's not a lot of elitism in places like that.
Many interesting stories behind every object, why it's there, why it was acquired. And
in every object, a story, and in every curated space, a story of that person who curated it.
So if we bring that back to the misconceptions, people are looking to Japan for answers, but what they perceive of Japan from the outside is often or can be misleading because there is a marketing done to kind of promote a certain side of Japan. There are headlines that are kind of trying to sell a certain lifestyle, a certain aspect. So how to evaluate which of those answers or where the
right.
what the relevant things are that today are making Japan a great place.
Foreigners have long projected their own fantasies onto Japan. In fact, that's where the title of my book, Pure Invention, comes from. It's taken from a quote by Oscar Wilde, who said, there is no country such as Japan. There are no such people. And if you want to understand Japan, don't go to Japan. Just look at some woodblock prints by Hokusai, which he wrote this in the 1800s. Woodblock prints were basically the equivalent of manga or anime to us back then. And there are plenty of people out there who form their opinions about Japan today based on manga or anime as well. Japan's interesting because foreigners have long projected their own fantasies upon it, and Japan has in turn played to those fantasies. It's kind of complicit in this.
Cool Japan, for example, you mentioned before this kind of campaign by the government
Yes.
to promote Japan abroad.
Yes, which I find deeply ironic because the authorities in Japan, defined as everybody from politicians to teachers to parents, PTA associations, for many, many years did everything they could to suppress things like anime and manga and video games. Japan was, in fact, one of the first nations to enact nationwide laws restricting young people from entering arcades and things like that back in the 1980s. A lot of this stuff was seen as junk culture, even dangerous. Our kids are reading manga and anime or watching anime. They're going to grow up to be, living in a fantasy land. Somehow around the turn of the millennium, Japanese politicians started to realize, well, wait a second, there's actually, some value to this. And I'm glad they changed their tune, but I do see it as kind of ironic that for so long, this stuff it wasn't ignored so much as almost at times being actively suppressed. And now it's sort of this panacea for the Japanese government, who sees, pop culture as being a way to drive money into the country, which it is. But there's an irony to that as well.
How has writing this book and doing all this research and diving deep into this pop culture changed your life here, changed your perspective on living here?
Well, it's given me certainly a deeper view of how these things are made and how they're consumed. And that took me away from wanting to simply translate products and more into wanting to facilitate the people making them, to try to help reach audiences abroad and help foreign countries who want to kind of, interact with Japanese creatives. I was, deeply moved, and Japanese pop culture changed my life. Japanese pop culture changed my life. It's not any exaggeration to say that. And so I kind of see what I'm doing now as paying it forward a little bit. Trying to help where I can, not simply just in terms of translation or localization, but cultural facilitation as well.
What are the things that you are particularly interested right now that you want to kind of help promote abroad or kind of facilitate overseas?
I am right now working on a book for the Japanese audience. I'm writing a book in Japanese that kind of explains a lot of the things that I talked about in Pure Invention, but frames it in terms of how this new Japanism, as I call it, Shin Japanism. Japanism is a term that comes from the French Japanism, that refers to the boom for Japanese culture that happened after the opening of the ports in 1850s, and a flood of Japanese merchandise entered Western markets. More like crafts and art than our as we think of it today. But that changed the direction of global culture. It transformed, our image of what was sophisticated. It transformed the way artists looked at the world.
And a lot of big French painters like Matisse also have painted things inspired by these woodblock prints and that style, and it did change a lot of things. But it also created the first fantasies as well.
Yes. One of my favorite Van Gogh paintings is him he paints his doctor, but the background is a wall in his home, which is just all woodblock prints. Those are the first kind of Japanese pop cultural crossovers. But to answer your question, I don't think Japanese creators realize how much of an impact their creations have abroad. And I'm nervous that they're going to start trying to actively appealing to foreign audiences. And I think Japan is at its best when it's creating things for itself.
I was going to ask, would you think if a Japanese game creator, for example, would make a game with intention of this game is for, let's say, an American audience, would it be less good, less appealing to that actual American audience than if it would be an original Japanese game for a Japanese audience that a foreign audience picks up and gets like?
Well, it's tough. You can't make generalizations, right? Because there's always exceptions to the rule. Like, for instance, Hideo Kojima. He's the Japanese video game director famed for the Metal Gear series. Most recently, he's moved to America and is making games with a very Western flair to them. The Death Stranding series, the second one of which just came out recently. They're packed with Western stars. They're set in Western settings. He is very, very aware of Western audiences when he makes his games. And I think they're great. They're very unique. They're strange, which is something you actually don't see very much in commercial products anymore. There's a great sameness to a lot of games.
Commercialization, just wanting to bank on the franchise name
Exactly.
and just not take the risk to disappoint fans.
Well, one of the things I love about Kojima's work is I can't say I always enjoy it, but I always respect it. It's always coming from this one person's unique vision. And so he's making a great go of it that way. But I don't think he's necessarily thinking about targeting Western audiences so much as incorporating Western sorts of aesthetics and things into his games. I think the average Japanese creator is probably better off just focusing on the local market. They don't have the resources to go live in Hollywood and hang out with, top actors, Norman Reedus or all of these people who Kojima's put into his games. They live in Japan. And actually, I spent time recently embedded at Shonen Jump magazine for an article that I'm writing for The New Yorker. It should be coming out a little bit later this month. I wanted to see how manga were made, why Shonen Jump's manga are so popular all over the world. And I spoke to the editor-in-chief. I spoke to mid-level editors. I went to a manga artist studio and watched as he and his editor were working on brainstorming, the next installments of their manga. And one of the things I learned is that at Jump, they encourage the artists and editors to, in a certain sense, think small. Think about the things that you like. Think about the world around you. Base it on that. Don't worry about what Americans or French people or, Spanish-speaking people or anybody wants. Worry about what you want. Worry about what you want to see happen in front of you. Because if you draw something that appeals deeply to you and the people who are around you, it's probably going to appeal more broadly too. And that was a really eye-opening thing to me, because when you think of Shonen Jump, you think of this globally dominant entertainment company.
And people come from all over the world to buy the editions that are being printed out here in Japanese, even if they can't read them.
Absolutely. And it's all over the world. Spanish speakers, French speakers, Italian, you name it. Asian, the Asian world. Shonen Jump is huge in China, Korea, even places that are typically, have had issues with Japan, historically speaking. Shonen Jump goes beyond all of that.
How do these companies manage to remain so focused on thinking small in a way and on thinking on their market, what they like, what they want to do, and not having this global success, this global interest affect their way of doing things?
Japanese culture has, often in the past, I saw it described or heard it described from foreign sources as being inherently conservative. But I don't think that's true, especially not in a political way. But what I do think it is cautious. Japanese culture, I think, and it's a little bit almost introverted in a way. I like to, if America is a big sloppy dog, jumping up on you and licking your face, Japan is more like a cat. It's more, you walk into the room and the cat's like, oh, who are you? It might even like move away from you. You try to pet it, you can't quite touch it, but then eventually it warms to you and you form a relationship. That's why we love cats too. We love dogs and we love cats. I think Japan is the Japanese people don't naturally think about the bigger world. They're kind of more thinking about the world that's around them. And it's turning out that that kind of small focus is a plus in a world where algorithms are increasingly dictating what we see and what we consume. And when things like AI technologies are automatically generating content for us to look at, Japan, being cautious, being more introverted, tends to stick with what it knows. In the case of Shonen Jump, they have a system that they've built up over decades. Shonen Jump magazine started in 1968. And for decades, they've been honing their kind of creative model. Why change it now?
Are new technologies, is AI affecting Japanese pop culture in a way that it will push them to integrate that, or will they push back, or how?
Famously, Japan has always been a little bit behind the curve when it comes to post-internet technologies. You know, there's always these jokey sort of articles in newspapers. They're still using fax machines. And Japan truly is not an innovator in the AI space. It's interesting because back in the 80s, it was at the forefront of AI technologies in a lot of ways. But when we're talking about modern LLMs and things like that, it's not. So Japan is a little bit almost behind the curve when it comes to social media, when it comes to algorithms, when it comes to AI, when it comes to these things that we think of as the cutting edge of technology these days. And I actually think now that is proving an unexpected advantage, because we in the West are getting tired of these things like algorithms and AI slop and social media. Japan still produces pop culture in a very bespoke, personal, human way. At Shonen Jump, for instance, it always comes down to one artist and their team of assistants drawing on the page in some room in Tokyo or wherever they live. It comes down to people telling stories for other people. AI is not involved in that process. And I think increasingly that is going to be an asset for Japan in a world where AI and other technologies are threatening to consume us.
In university, you were hesitating what you wanted to study. You said English major, Japanese major, and journalism. Mm-hmm. And now you've written a book, Pure Invention. You're writing essays for the New York Times, the New Yorker, and more. Do you see your work, your research, as a sort of journalistic work into Japanese pop culture?
Well, there's certainly Pure Invention and the essays I write, there's certainly a journalistic aspect to them. I don't work in a newsroom, but there is a journalistic aspect in the sense I go out and I talk to people and I tell stories. But I never set out to become a journalist or to become a writer or even to become a localizer. I tended to just follow my dreams, to follow what I wanted to do. If it felt good, I did it. Because of that, I often had a difficult time explaining what I did, or even now what I do. You know, I localize, but I'm not a localizer. I write, but I don't think of myself as a writer with a capital W, you know, or a journalist with a capital J. I'm just a curious person who likes, you know, investigating the things that have personal meaning to me.
A person curious enough that others thought so as well. And so one day, Japanology came knocking on the door. Peter Barakan,
who you interviewed,
who we interviewed here as well, came and kind of made a story on you. How was that for you? Did the NHK just kind of call you up out of the blue?
Japanology Plus, that was a lot of fun. I was a reporter on Japanology Plus. I did this, it's called a corner in Japanese, one little segment of the Japanology Plus show called Plus One. And I did that for about 5 or 6 years, from 2015 to about 2021. That all started in 2014 when I got an email from what was then known as, it wasn't Japanology Plus then, I think it was Begin Japanology. Mm-hmm. It's gone through several iterations. And Japanology Plus is a show that goes out in the field and, you know, explores all sorts of aspects of Japanese culture. But every season they devote 3 or 4 episodes to what they call Japanophiles, where they'll focus on one person, a foreign person who's living in Japan and doing interesting things, kind of like your show, actually. And I was picked up to be profiled by that. At that point, I had, Hiroko and I had put out several books about yokai. We wrote a book together in 2008 called Yokai Attack, which is a kind of survival guide to surviving encounters with monsters from Japanese folklore.
If I'm not mistaken, it's published by Tuttle.
It was originally published by Kodansha International, and then it moved over to Tuttle when Kodansha International went under. And there was a sequel called Ninja Attack, because that's important. And then we wrote the third book in the trilogy, Yurei Attack, which is the Japanese ghost survival guide. And those books, I think, are what attracted NHK World to me. And so they wanted me to talk about characters, my interest in Japanese characters, both from folklore and modern sorts of ones like we've been talking about. And so they set me up with Peter. I showed Peter around a really wonderful place in Tokyo called Nakano Broadway.
Oh, where all the watches are.
Yeah, wait, don't say the watches. It's supposed to be an otaku.
It used to be, right?
Yes,
now it's
and now
more
it's
like
been
famous for its watches.
What is up? I don't understand this. Every time I go, it's like there's another watch store and another. How many watch stores do you need in one place? I love watches, but I mean, there's a lot of watch stores there now. But I was first started going there because it was full of pop cultural stores. There's a company called Mandarake that has all that sells all sorts of used stuff. And if you want vintage toys or vintage records or video game systems or what have you, Mandarake is probably one of the first places you're going to go. And I showed Peter around there and we had a talk, and it went so well that afterwards the producer said, hey, we're thinking of changing the format of the show. We're going to have a little segment where somebody's going to go out and after Peter interviews the expert, that person will go out and actually do whatever the subject is. Are you interested? And I said, sure. And it turned into a really, really fun 5 years of just every week pretty much going out and filming. So that would throw me into all sorts of wacky situations.
How do you manage to balance? You had still the company, localizing things, maybe less than before, but you were still doing it at times. You have writing, you're researching the essays, consulting, and now host on Japanology Plus.
I was young back then, and actually, but it was tough, and as I've gotten older, I've realized I need to kind of focus on the things that are really important to me personally. And so I made the decision when Pure Invention came out that I would take a break from the show so that I could spend time promoting it. Of course, what ended up happening was when the book came out in the spring of 2020, it arrived right in the beginning of the pandemic. Everything shut down, and actually the TV show shut down as well. For several years, Japanology Plus was on hiatus. And by the time it came back, I realized it was just time for me to start focusing on my own stuff, my own writing. I loved being on that show, and it was great going into all of these situations and having people research stuff for me and give me a script and do this. But I wanted to kind of go on my own adventures.
So what adventure are you on now? What is Matt Alt doing today?
Well, I am doing things like writing my newsletter, which lets me investigate things that might not necessarily be, ready for mainstream media. But I'm also doing things like, what I was just talking about earlier, writing about Shonen Jump. I'm able to say, what is it about X? And then do a deep dive on it myself. And because now I have books and I've been on TV and I've written for magazines, I'm able to call up places like Japanese publishers or Japanese anime studios and say, hey, will you let me take a look at what you're doing? Will you let me tell your story? Some of them say no, but sometimes they say yes. And it turns into a really, really interesting sort of experience. So it's nice to be able to be my own boss again.
How much of a deep dive is this? How long do you spend researching, let's say, a lengthy essay that you want to write about Shonen Jump from the moment you have this idea of like, I want to understand how the manga actually got so popular and why this magazine has been such a big place, to the article coming out soon?
Shonen Jump took basically a year. It took a year. And from the moment when I first met one of the editors-in-chief, up until all of the discussions that happened, and then the reporting happened, and then it'll finally come out hopefully later this month, July of 2025. Or August of 2025. That'll be basically a year since that started. So that it isn't possible to make a living doing that. Even though the New Yorker pays pretty well, it doesn't pay well enough to spend an entire year. This has to be personally interesting to me as well. So my dream is to take these things that I'm researching now and build them into a bigger narrative, a sequel, as it were, to Pure Invention. That's what I want to be doing in the future, is telling where Pure Invention stopped in 2020. That's when the book came out. I'd like to write the version of that for the next decade.
So there's going to be plenty more to come, plenty more work, plenty more deep dives and research.
Stay tuned as breaking the fourth wall here.
I'm really interested in the response you had from this. You put out all these articles, you write the books, you go on TV, and you share this expertise, this vast knowledge you've gathered over decades, and you get to share and interact with people. What are they most surprised about, especially perhaps the Japanese side? That
everybody knows these products. Everybody knows the Walkman. Everybody knows the Nintendo Entertainment System. You know, if you're a Gen Z or millennial or alpha, Pokemon is probably part of your DNA practically. I don't think even the deepest fans of these games as consumers know what was happening behind the scenes to get these products made. And so they're always interested to hear more about that, because they're all on their own journeys, just like I was. You know, when I first encountered that robot toy as a kid, it was called a Shogun Warrior. When I first encountered that toy as a kid, it set me off on a journey, and they're on their own journeys. And I like to think that my work will help speed them along the way.
Do you still have that Shogun Warrior, or do you have a new?
Still have that Shogun Warrior. I still collect. I am a avid collector of Japanese vintage toys today. I do still have that toy. It is a Geta Dragon. It's this big red robot with this kind of spiky head, 2 feet tall, made of plastic. It's important to me to still hold on to that. Every once in a while, I'll look at it and be like, wow, it all started from here.
Having physical objects has this kind of effect, right? You see it on your shelf and it brings back the memories, the feelings, and remotivates you. It can be the same with books.
Absolutely. But this is one of the big differences between me as a Gen Xer, I think, and the younger generations. And this isn't some kind of kids these days, get off my lawn. It's just an observation. Things are still very important to me. I don't think things are as important to younger generations. They're much more about experiences and data. They're digital natives. It makes perfect sense. If I had grown up with the internet in my life from a young age, I'd probably be the same way. Pokemon's merchandise are cards. There isn't really I'm sure that there are figures and things of them, but if you're a Pokemon fan, it's not really about that. It's about the games. It's about the experience in the games, the save data, which Pokemon you have in your Pokedex, what cards are in your deck, that sort of thing. For me, it was always when I watched Gundam, I wanted those model kits. I wanted those toys. And when I had them, that was my way of immersing myself in that world.
Maybe that's an angle for your analysis for the next decade of Pure Inventions out of Japan, the digital version.
Yeah.
Matt Alt, this was a fascinating conversation. I learned a lot. Do you feel like there's maybe something important that we didn't get into that you would have liked to bring up today?
Wow, so many things. Follow your dreams. That's what I always tell, people who reach out to me, and surround yourself with people who are doing things that you want to do. People always ask me, how did you get to do what you're doing? How is it that you became a localizer of games? How did you become a writer of books? And that was because I surrounded myself with people who were better than I was, who were playing the game at a higher level. And, realizing that jealousy can be a really healthy motivator if you channel it right. If you channel it back into yourself, into improving yourself. So it's always, whenever people ask me, I tell them, find the people who are doing what you want to do and make friends with them and be friendly rivals with them. Challenge yourself against them.
like as a reference to Pokemon. I don't know the names of the characters in English, but Sasha, as he's called in French, and
Ash in English,
and his
Satoshi
rival,
in Japanese. Yeah.
And his rival.
Right.
Friends, but kind of
Yes.
constantly pushing each other to go
Absolutely.
to
Well, it's like the saying goes, it's about the friends we made along the way.
perfect way to finish this
Yes.
podcast episode. Matt, I'll thank you very much. All the links and references will be in the description for people that are interested in reaching out or reading your essays. Find your book online as well, or subscribing to your newsletter if they want weekly, monthly updates. Thank you.
Thank you for having me on. This has been a blast.
Thank you everyone for listening and watching. This was Unpacking Japan, and we'll be back in the next episode. Bye.
Thank you so much for joining us today. I hope you enjoyed this episode as much as I did. Please hit the subscribe button so you don't miss out on future conversations. And we'd love to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comment section down below. And if you enjoyed this episode, here are a couple more that we think you'll enjoy. Thanks again for your support, and we'll see you next time.